All right. So I'm going to answer this, or I'm going to read this. So thank you for this great presentation. One phenomenon I'm struck by as an ASL L2 learner is the concept of elite signing, which I guess is used by some ASL community members to characterize the idealized white, deaf of deaf fluent signer. So I wonder if you think that ideology overlaps with or is completely different from the native signer ideology that linguists hold. Throwing you a toughie, smile.
Yes, I need to get some clarification on the word elite. I've heard the term used to mean Gallaudet College students, specifically deaf people who sign more English-like, quote unquote. Is that what you mean, Ryan? Or are you talking about now? I feel like the concept of elite may have changed over the years.
So Ryan says in the chat, I agreed with you. It doesn't have a set definition. So it sounds like it might be another ideology to be um, looked at. That was my comment.
Yeah. Yes. I I just wanted to add something that I just thought about related to visual representation of deaf signers. Uh, I looked at the lit review very in depth, but I've noticed that if a publication includes ASL, for example, or sign language stimuli, it means that a deaf person is responsible for making up a sentence or signing or whatever it is that the task is at hand. But often that person who is the model for this made up signing is done in a lab or is often someone who is a model, if you will, for the researcher. And I think in that way, those specific individuals have become the representation or the model of what is good or elite or pure ASL or sign language. And that could be interpreted as elite signing, perhaps.
Thank you, Lena. Yes, next question. Lena, I loved your visualizations and all of the birds. Yes. Do you think that certain disciplines of linguistics, for sign language linguistics, have handled the idea of signers better or with more nuance, should I say? Corpus linguistics, sociolinguistics, for example.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Corpus linguistics, I think it really depends on which corpus linguistics we're looking at. The first one of Oslin corpus linguistics that was set up, or are we talking about BSL corpus? Because I feel that the timeline of different sign language corpora that were established, it varies in their decisions of who to include in the corpus. I think that we should look at all and see what's changed. But yes, corpus linguistics is doing a better job of including sign language variety in the models. The sociolinguistics, yes. I think that we are definitely taking cues from them and having different demographic information provided for signers. We definitely need to follow what other researchers have done in other languages. Again, however, it's really hard to say, is it all perfect? Can we be more inclusive? Again, I think it depends on the researcher, the time of the publication, so much, yes. But yes, I think that corpus and sign language linguistics, social and societal behaviors are really important to use.
Thank you, Lena. This is so important. Do you have suggestions for alternative frameworks that could be useful?
Yes, I know some scholars have commented and used terms like L1, L2, based on deaf people's view of their language experience. And I think that's helpful. To ask, how they identify themselves and why. For me, in my experience, deaf people who identify themselves as native signers, it's not because of their family or age of exposure, but that they consider themselves fluent and accessible. Their language is accessible. People view them as being highly competent. And the idea, I think the term itself, regardless of how we use it, the important thing is how we define and who we include in this definition.
Thank you. Next question. I've been grappling with the difficulty of needing a norm to compare to in order to show the real problem of language deprivation versus how to avoid valorizing nativeness. You mentioned this a little. I was hoping to hear more if you have other thoughts.
Someone asked me, do we need a baseline, or if we can get rid of the decentralization of the deaf native signer, can we just have a baseline? And I think that gives me the impression that we're assuming that the 5% has the same baseline and also the same norm. We as sign language linguists, that 5% doesn't share and agree upon what is considered grammatical, what is ungrammatical. And so I really feel like the issue of variation in grammar has been accepted, but it hasn't been discussed. What do we do with the variation? I feel like many sign language linguists know, but they don't want to deal with it, so they avoid it. And maybe just put down, we don't know how to go forward with it in a publication. And I also think that it would be nice if we could research more about language experience or use of the 95% in their language use, in how to measure their skills in a more nuanced way. Meaning that maybe compared with one another, instead of comparing those people to the 5%, that would be better, because that 5%, are they really the same? And I'll also add, again, I'm not sure if sign language linguists all around know this, but at least with me and my deaf friends, and collaborators, we've talked about deaf people from deaf families. And I got to be honest with you, they're not considered like really fluent signers. They have this oddity about them, their variety in the language, their experience, the different types of schools that they've entered. Some of them do have oral or been exposed to English speech, or actually use cute speech at home. There's such a variety. Are those really 5% fluent models? Are they modeling how we as the 95% sign? I also think that we should definitely sit down and talk about this, talk about the norm. Do we need to norm the deaf people? Is it psycholinguistic research that we can really take on?
We have somebody who wants to ask a question in ASL, so please unmute your video and ask your question, and we can pin you as well.
Hi there. Can I go ahead and begin? Is the interpretation coming through? Okay, great. Thank you so much for a remarkable talk. I found this fascinating. Actually, also, can everyone see me all right? Lena, are you seeing my video? Thank you for an outstanding talk, really just so fascinating. And it prompted a lot of thinking on my end. As the world is changing and increasingly people are multilingual, well, at least in Quebec, where I used to work, there's a lot of bilingual deaf people. And bilingual also being interpreted as people who not just know a sign language and a written language, but two sign languages. I think the problem here then also becomes the distinction between what's an L1 and what's an L2. In Quebec, anyway, I don't know about in the English-speaking world, but in Quebec, we use a different term to describe the language of reference. So that means how a person perceives themselves. So on a daily basis, which language do I use? That determines what sorts of services you get, what sorts of things you have access to, and accommodations you might get according to. And so that's a more social push about language than I think we see elsewhere. Sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't. Because perhaps I might identify in a certain way, but it's, well, without going too far down that rabbit hole, the point is there's a lot of variation. So I'm thinking about research into multilingualism is where I'm going. And actually, I don't really have a question, but just sharing a thought about there's a lot to consider on this very topic. Thank you so much again for your outstanding talk. It's really awesome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Here is the next question in the Q&A. This is bold and powerful and also dangerous work. There are forces in the deaf communities and respective interpreting communities that want to keep the idea of nativeness. Can you expand more on the benefits of increasing the community belongingness by removing this idealized notion of native signer?
Yes, yes. Thank you. Whew. My answer is based on my personal experience and what I've heard from other deaf friends and colleagues. So there are a lot of linguistic ideologies about native signers. ASL teachers, interpreters, deaf education, deaf educators, and people who go into those fields, or sign language linguistics in general as one of the fields that people go into. But you get the information at you. And sometimes as a deaf person, I feel like I'm not a native signer. My parents are not deaf. I wasn't exposed to ASL early enough before the age of 2 or 3. That's very discouraging to hear as a person who considers themselves competent or native-like. And so sometimes we see the harmful messages that deaf people are told, you're not native enough. You don't fit the definition or the criteria. And so I think that kind of harm in language attitudes is out there. And it's really not helpful. The consequences from that have been widespread. And I also think at the same time, we've established a strong bias with research and interpreters and teachers that people say, oh, you're not deaf or deaf. Oh, yeah, we can't recruit you in our research, or you can't teach ASL, or you can't work in a deaf school. You can't be involved with interpreter training. Again, this is not something that I know that there's a system, but I've heard that there are things out there that dictate to this. It's a huge benefit to reduce the bias if we can. And we could also have more diversity in our research, in our interpreting, in our teaching, if we would just welcome and cherish those deaf experience and those lived experiences better.
Thank you so much for that answer. We have another question. I appreciate so many points you raised in the talk. You mentioned the use of contact signing and also most signers being bilingual in the written/spoken language. How do you think we should incorporate the bilingual nature of deaf signers into sign language research?
I think it depends on your research question. I think we should look more at translanguaging, because I feel that that's something that we do every day. Especially the concept of contact sign comes up, And, it can represent our livelihood and what we do. It's really cool to look around at different signers who use translanguaging with sign, with speech, with talk, with writing, with pointing, with interacting with objects. And I think one well-known topic in the deaf community, maybe in linguistics, I'm not really sure, is that we have talked for a long time about who is really good at accommodating or fitting a person who signs differently. So the cognitive flexibility that deaf people have to engage with people who are not as fluent as we are, perhaps in a different language, we accommodate them very well and we adapt to who they are and how they sign. And we need to look at that accommodation as research more. But yes, it's a great question indeed.
So then our final Q&A question. Thank you so much for this very engaging presentation. You've got me thinking about the issues you've addressed, about how the issues you've addressed are impacted by the fact that signed languages are also rare in most communities. In other words, regardless of parental hearing status, deaf children may not be exposed to many different varieties of signing. How might this impact language development and the propagation of linguistic variance in signing communities?
Wow, Jill, that's a big question. I have to think about that and digest it a little bit, but impact language development. Okay, I will answer, but maybe it's a little off or not quite getting to the point. What's more clear to me, I think, often in language acquisition research, I tend to see research analyzing deaf children and their language development based on what we, quote unquote, know about ASL grammar, based on deaf native adults. And so that means, what's already been documented and researched and analyzed, looking at their language development. But at the same time, we know that deaf children are exposed to a myriad of signer models or those that are not. So some don't have native signer exposure. And so perhaps we should back up and think, how do we do more inclusive documentation, description of sign language, not limited to just that 5%. And you're right, related to analysis of sign language networks, who deaf children are interacting with, where they get their input, how the input looks, etc. I think that we need to backtrack and figure out what children can express, how they can express it. It might not fit what people think as the deaf native child should look like, but the ideas are there, and I think it's important to highlight them. And, I'll have to email you a more in-depth answer later if I may.